Everybody else seems to get an introduction.
Bremhill's own historian of note.
So that's me out of it straight away.
Yes.
Right.
Couldn't come here, but David could.
Okay. Well, I'm talking about the churchyards in the parish. Where did I start on churchyards? I'll tell you where I started. Oh, it's not working. Yes, it is. There we go. The reason I'm a bit tired is because I was in the churchyard in the early hours of this morning, just checking a few things out. And
Yeah, that's you.
And there actually are ghosts in the churchyard. And she's here now. Has anybody spotted her? Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of the people in the churchyard and celebrate their lives. We can't be gloomy about people when they're dead. We've got to think of the good things about them. So I'm going to be talking about people that have died in the war, people that have perhaps been murdered. Let me move my screen so that I can see it. People that have been murdered, a bit of tragedy. There's a lot of tragedy in this village and the parish. There's a lot of love as well. And we've got quite a few heroes that we probably don't know about. So let's move on. My target audience is better than it was the last time I gave a talk to the History Society. Let's hope it carries on. Now, why did I start getting interested in people in the churchyard? Well, Mr. Fry was the man that started me off. He, I knew, was in the Home Guard, and I was looking at the Home Guard. And this guy died, and when I inquired and got his death certificate, I'd already seen the register. The church register said, died at Carn Market, enemy action. And I just loved the death certificate because the cause of death was due to war operations. No, most of these things say they died of bronchitis or pneumonia. He died to war operations. I don't know what that means. It was in the newspapers. There's something making a noise here. Ah, my phone. Stop. The clerk of the council registered the death. That's very unusual. Newspapers didn't publish it because they didn't want the Germans to know that they got Carn Market. So a plane came over, dropped 3 bombs, and I'm afraid Frank Norton was dead. That got me interested in who else was in the churchyard that was interesting. And the Home Guard formed a guard of honour for this gentleman, and he's buried in the churchyard. We've also had other deaths that have happened, and I think the most famous one is the lady that got murdered. Now, I don't know whether you know about Amy Salter. Does anybody know about Amy Salter? Yeah. Somebody knows about Amy Salter. Jolly good. You can probably fill my gaps in. She lived at, I think it's number 23. Anyway, she got married. She lived in Hillmartin, got married to Mr. Salter, and she lived at 24 Fox Cottage. Does anybody live there now? Right. Well, she was a kindly lady. Her husband died just before the Second World War, and she took in some evacuees. And there were quite a lot of evacuees came into the parish, and one came to stay with her about September 39, something like that. And here we can see a picture of some of the evacuees with a dead fox. I love that one, the dead fox in the middle. So, it's gone too far. So there's the lady that murdered her. She was an evacuee. She went back to London. She found a boyfriend. How nice. Unfortunately, the boyfriend was desperate for money. If you don't get me some money, I'm going to commit suicide, he said to this young lady. This young lady thought, where do I get some money from? The lovely Mrs. Salter has money. So she came along to see Mrs. Salter. said, "Can I have some money for my boyfriend, please?" Mrs. Salter said, "No, you can't." The young lady argued and argued and argued, and went to the garden, got a large stone out, bashed Amy round the head and said, "I'll bash you a bit more if you don't give me any money." She said, "I'm not giving you money," and she got bashed a bit more. She became unconscious, lost a lot of blood, and I hate to say this, but all the photographs are in the police crime files of the bloody rooms. She found some money in the upstairs drawer, cleared off back to London, left Amy on the floor. Amy was discovered at tea time and she got taken to hospital. She died at 10 o'clock that evening, 1956. Well, going too far again. Now, I tried to find out what happened about the lady that did the murdering. So I did a lot of inquiries. Did she get a prison sentence? What happened? Now I've now discovered that her records... Well, first of all, who's planning to live another 19 years? Can you put your hands up? Anybody planning to live 19 years? Because I've got a favour to ask. Oh, great, there's at least 6 of you. Now, in 19 years' time, these records are going to be released. And we'll know what happened to Pat Newman. Did she get let out? What happened? She didn't go to prison because she was unfit to plead. So she could be here tonight. She would be, what, 90-ish now? I can't find any mention of her anywhere. George Hanna, Moravian. He spent 19 years in Jamaica, didn't come home once. And he was looking at looking after, that is, the slaves that were newly released from slavery, and some were not, and they were lost souls, and he actually ministered to them. He retired, came back to Bristol, his wife died, he retired, came back to Bristol, and died, unfortunately, a couple of years later, and he's buried in the Moravian churchyard. We've got a few heroes in the parish that we do, some of us know that, some of us don't. One that took my attention is just on the right as you go into Bremhill churchyard here. It says John Leslie Moore, MC, OBE. Now, they don't give military crosses away very easily as on. Has anybody got one here? No, I didn't think you would have. Well, he got one. What did he get it for? He was a railway engineer, trained at Swindon as a railway engineer. He was called up into the Royal Engineers. And what you may or may not know is that ammunition was taken directly from the factory to the front. Sometimes the train stopped part way, sometimes they didn't. At Arras, a train was shot by the Germans and the back end of it started exploding. The driver did a runner, parked the train, middle of town, just outside Arras, and did a runner. What happened was that this gentleman jumped in the train, he knew how to drive a train, drove it out of town, and then he did a runner, and the train blew up. He saved possibly 2,000 lives. He got a military cross for that. However, he wasn't content with just getting that medal and his World War I medals. He carried on to have a great career working for the railways at a national level, and he was the Chief Safety Inspector for the entire rail system, and that's what he got his OBE for. We've also got people in the parish that have never ever been talked about, and one of these is Alan Adcock. He is buried, or his ashes are at Tiverton. Why do I say Alan Adcock? His daughter's here now, and she's married to me, so I'll probably get told off in a minute. Alan was an up-and-coming engineer, and he was working away in 1944, and I don't understand why this suddenly zooms on to the next slide when I don't press the button. He was there working away on the war effort, as everybody was, and the telephone rang, and somebody said, Brigadier so-and-so here at the War Office, wonder if you could pop down tomorrow to see if the War Office, section TN5, you know, the top secret section. So, this is a bit odd. So off he goes to the War Office. Now, If I show you his death certificate, if you can read that, at the bottom it says he was a consultant civil engineer. Can anybody think what sort of civil engineering was going on in early 1944, middle of 1944?
D-Day. D-Day.
D-Day was coming up, and an essential part of D-Day was getting the troops ashore and the equipment ashore. Mulberry harbours needed civil engineers. So he toddled off to London, and they said, you're in the army now, by the way, and it's top secret, don't tell anybody. Now, his job was to get the Mulberry harbours, the British Mulberry Harbour, Mulberry B, to make sure the caissons, that's the outer rim of the harbour, was put together properly and built properly. And these were massive concrete emplacements of 6,000 tonnes, which were towed across the channel and put in place outside the harbour as an outer defence. And then there was pierheads, etc., put inside. So he had the responsibility of getting them winterised and making sure they'd last longer than the 90 days that they were originally planned. Absolutely massive structures towed across the channel. Concrete, that's why it needed a civil engineer. And then they were laid in position, and you can see in this picture how they were laid before they were winterised. And that is an aerial view taken at the time from an aircraft, and you can see the outer breakwater, and the caissons are there, and then they're just Liberty ships. But then you have the pierheads there, and the caissons here. So this man made sure they lasted. The British one, you may know the American one, got blown away because it wasn't put together properly. So we actually have a big thank you to say to Alan Adcock for making sure this harbour survived, because there were many, many millions of people that actually got released from war. It was a terrific achievement. And here he is in the middle here, after the war, at a dinner that was held with the high and mighty from Costains, Langs, etc. And there is the man. Now, if any of you want to check up and listen a bit more about this, all his war records are available. He's talking at the Imperial War Museum. There's about 2 hours of him saying what his involvement in the Mulberry Harbour was. He's in Tiverton. We have another war story here that most of you will know about. It's George Chubb. He lived here in the village at Dawn's house, number 23, Dawn?
He lived in 22.
22, did you say?
Yes.
22, I was a house out. He and the family lived there. He is the only World War I soldier that was evacuated, badly injured, evacuated and brought ultimately back to England. What you don't know, we talked about the Great Western before. They made ambulance trains in World War I at Swindon, and these were sort of 3 beds, so they could put the soldiers on right from the field hospital and bring them all the way back via Dover back to wherever hospital they were going to go. You may say, but they have different gauges on the railways in continental Europe to we do here. These carriages had an axle that could be widened to go on the wider gauge. Quite amazing achievement. So the actual carriage went straight on the train and was brought back. So they stayed in bed all the way. What a way to go. Probably beats Eurotunnel. He was evacuated to Grainwell Military Hospital, where he unfortunately died. And that's his headstone here, which the Parochial Church Council refurbished a few years ago. And the black object on the left is Jim Scott when it was rededicated. At the entrance to the church is a sign saying the Commonwealth War Graves. That took 5 years of communication for them to agree to put that there, because it was a private grave, not one that the government had paid for. The family didn't want a national type grave, so they paid for it. It also meant that maintaining it was a slight problem. But it's there now, we've got a sign. I'm so pleased. And the day after he died was the first tank to appear on the Somme. Another war veteran, Alfred Long. He joined the Middlesex Regiment initially, and then he was transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. He learned to fly at Upavon, just down the road. And a tragedy, really. He was flying along a few days after he qualified, and his job that day was to fly along straight and level at 2,000 feet, whilst one of the other trainees could practice shooting him. Well, the other pilot, Lieutenant Stromer, was rather over-enthusiastic and went straight through his tail. Both aircraft plummeted to the ground, and both the pilot and the trainee pilot, in fact, died. Now, why didn't they jump out? Well, they weren't issued with parachutes. They'd been invented, but they weren't issued. Now, if you look at his casualty card, you get the full story. Now, I realise you probably can't read that, but it does say practising fighting, etc., etc., and there was the accident. And it tells you what sort of aircraft they were driving. Now, this one I found in the investigation, especially for John Harris. They were making cartoons in 1914. This is signed at the bottom, whoops, gone too far again, at the bottom by a member of the Harris. Oh dear, I am definitely pressing the wrong buttons now. S. Harris, signed just as John Harris signs his cartoons. So, John, I hope you appreciate that. We had another World War I death, Private Harding at Foxham. I don't really know what to say about this gentleman. He married 1905-ish. He was called up quite late in life. He got badly injured right at the end of the First World War. He got 3 young children, teenagers actually, and still a youngish wife, and he died 6 months after the end of the war in hospital. His wife was so grief-stricken, she died 6 months later. However, all is not lost. There's been plenty of love in the parish. There still is plenty of love in the parish. Emilio Vanzellotti. Now, a lot of you are familiar with his name. He was an Italian gentleman. He was taken prisoner of war in North Africa, and he was given the opportunity to come to England or America as a prisoner. He chose England. So after quite a difficult journey to Glasgow, he was allocated a prisoner of war camp in Wiltshire. The Italian prisoners generally were let out. So he got a job eventually at Bosmere Farm in Titherton. The farmer there, Mr. Cottle, was taking him backwards and forwards to his camp and thought this is a bit off. So he said to the Home Office, could I have him living here? We'll keep our eye on him and make sure he doesn't get up to mischief. So that's what happened. So he lived in the farm with Mr. Cottle, and a lot of people, the older people particularly, used to say he was a familiar sight riding around on his bicycle. Whoops. However, 1954, times were bad in Italy. A young lady, very bravely with a friend, came to England to work, and she worked in Chippenham as a cook for one of the large houses. They met, and the rest, as they say, is history. They got married at the St Mary's Church in Station Hill. I just love this picture. It's been digitally enhanced, and I think it's great. And I've had 3 copies printed off on canvas to give to their 3 children for Christmas presents. It's a lovely picture. And with the magic of computers, you can actually bring them to life. So you can have them saying, hello, wasn't she pretty? And he looks very happy. So, love in the parish. We also had hard work in the parish. William Whitworth, buried in the churchyard behind me. His father got the contract to build the canal through the parish. His father died 1798-ish, and William took over. William moved to Stanley, thinking he was going to get married a couple of years later, which he did, to Rebecca. And he built this house. This is the only picture I've managed to find of it, a sketch. It was actually knocked down in 1974 and another house built. So, the sad thing about this is that his wife Rebecca, who's buried with him, actually died in a carriage accident going down Derry Hill. And she's also buried here. Their daughter Julia managed to survive, and she got married, moved to Liverpool, got married in the church here to a Liverpool chappie, and moved on to Liverpool and had 12 children. No talk about people in the graveyard is complete without talking about what is probably they say, the only black grave in the parish, or the earliest one, and it's Leonora. She's at Tiverton. She was 28 when she died. She came over as an 8-year-old as a slave. Her mum was a slave, her dad was a local general, and she was, is it mummified? Is that the word they use? When she was released from her being a slave, and she died as a free woman. She'd been 20 years as a free woman. She was educated at the Moravian Church, and then she helped out with the church as well. But she was only 28 when she died. Emancipation in the parish. Martha Burgess. I think probably before the change of the earlier century, if you were a teacher and got married, you couldn't be a lady teacher. So if you wanted to stay a teacher all your life, you didn't get married. Martha didn't get married, and she was a teacher at Foxham for 40 years. Now, if you go to Foxham, the photograph I've taken there on the right was only taken a couple of weeks ago. That tree was planted to celebrate, if that's the word to use, the death of Martha in 1883. She was 40 years the head teacher at Foxham School. Tragedy. We all probably know about the vicar, Reverend Edrupt. What very few of us probably know about is that at the back of his rather grand tombstone is the tombstone of his son, Robert Arthur, who died aged 16 years. He was at school, at Royce's school, currently known as Abingdon School. It's on the River Thames. One night, evening, he and two of his mates took out the school skiff and went on the River Thames. A wave came along. If you get waves on rivers, a squall is probably better. Came along, blew the boat over. They all three went in the water, but last time his two mates saw him, he was swimming to the shore. He never got to the shore. He was found by the bridge at Abingdon, dead, 16 years of age. He's here in the churchyard. Happiness. I like a bit of happiness. Zephaniah Fry. He's actually in the Quaker burial ground. Does anybody know where that is? Okay, it's at Tiverton, but I don't think it's really open to the Joe public. Why I've included him and happiness is it was his grandchild that got qualified as a medical practitioner, sort of, and invented the modern day chocolate rather than chocolate being a drink. And we had Fry's chocolate. And I just love this. I don't know whether you can read it on the big screen, but it's desperation, pacification, expectation, acclimatization, realization. It's Fry's. And there's the Tiverton Collectors, Fry's chocolate. We have people that have a lot of duty. George Bull. And George Bull fell in love with a young lady that lived in Bremhill. He was from Chippenham. You can see a picture of him here in his Home Guard uniform. But why have I included him? He lived at 15 Bremhill, which is currently lived in by his grandson, Mark Kite. But most importantly, and the association with the church, is he was the grave digger. So he knew very much all these people that were dying. So he dug graves for 30 years. He served in the Home Guard. He was also a roadman, a lengthman, which maintained all footpaths and the roads in the parish. And he did live at number 15. And there's his headstone with his wife and his daughter. You probably know or knew was Nancy Kite. And the one other interesting person that I don't need to talk about now is Lord Edmund George Petty Fitzmaurice, who Simon mentioned very well, I thought, earlier. He was the second son of the Marquis of Lansdowne, and must have been hard work being the second son. And he devoted most of his life to doing things for people in the parish, from reading rooms, schools, and one of his last engagements, and that I read up with great interest, was the opening in 1921 of Titherton Village Hall. And although he lived in Bath, he wanted to be buried in the parish. Now, if you don't know where it is, it's by the spire of the church, this side of the spire if you want to go and see it. Now, there's a lot of other people, but I'm going to be told off for time in a minute. So we've got Ken Hanna, who only died a few years ago. He's got the Air Force Cross. We know about Air Force Crosses. What he also has was the LVO, Lieutenant of the Victorian Order. Not many people got that. It's given personally by the monarchy. And he got that for putting up with the Duke of Edinburgh's flying in a de Havilland Dove when he was at RAF Benson. And Duke of Edinburgh was very keen on flying, so he had to have Ken Hanna keeping his eye on him. Sarah Gingell, she became a pegler, but she bought Elm Farm. But she couldn't buy Elm Farm at auction because ladies weren't allowed to go to auctions and bid. She got the owners of Cuttenham Manor to do the bidding for her. So that's how the Elm Farm came to be in the Pegler family. William Henry Ponting, sad tale here, life got on top of him and he committed suicide here in the village. Martha Zippel, another teacher. Walter Pocock set up a major international dairy company, and he was once again in Titherton. Les Fry, I think a lot of us are familiar with Les Fry and his work in the church and his engraving in the church. Some lovely engraving there. I could do a whole talk on Les Fry, great guy, but the biggest thing for me was that he was a member of the British Sausage Eaters Society. Now defunct. I'm thinking of starting it again. David Reeves, 12-year-old, Christmas carol singing. He was walking along with a few of his mates and they were going from Foxham, cross the canal, cross to Elm Farm, and then on further singing carols, earn a few bob. He never made it across the canal, and they found his body 4 hours later, 12 years old. Bishop Harris. Now, I was intrigued by him. He's #1 entry in the new register, and he was Bishop of Gibraltar after he was bishop here. Big promotion. And then we got Frederick Preedy, another talk again. He's buried at Foxham, and he is one of the country's greatest people for making windows, stained glass windows. He's buried at Foxham. He didn't live at Foxham, but his father-in-law did, and his wife died, wanted to be buried by Dad, so he wanted to be buried by his wife, so that's how he's in Foxham. Very, very famous. And we've got people like John Tanner, and we've got Clive Hillier, another pilot in World War I. Didn't see action, he qualified right at the end of World War I, but he was the lieutenant in charge of the Home Guard in World War II. So that's my sort of talk over now. I'm 2 minutes over time, and I suppose I'd better just makes some mention of the Joseph Andrews, Charker. He was one of the 2 Coldstream Guards that, at the Battle of Waterloo, helped drag the dying General Picton off the battlefield. And there's an illustration, as you can see there, which is in the National Picture Gallery. So, thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this quick talk. There are ghosts there, there's no doubt about that. Anybody got any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for an absolute tour de force around all the churchyards of the parish. The good news is a number of those people's stories are addressed within the book, which you'll be able to buy later on. So beautifully set up there. Any questions for David, please? Yes, Julian.
The fourth name on the right of your previous in Master Wiltshire was my great-great-great-grandma.
Yes.
And Mark's 5th grade.
Yes, I meant to mention you, but didn't. But I think the fact that she's buried there, can we go back? I don't know if we can go back, it's not that easy to go back. We've got her down there. No, it's got to go all right through the raking. There we go. Yes. Oh, no. It's, which grave is it? Have I got a picture of it? No. Oh, yes, I have. William Wiltshire. Yeah. It's that one. And that is by the entrance to the church towards the wall of that end. I think it's interesting that she's buried here, and I think there's a tale attached to that, in that she couldn't be buried where she probably wanted to be buried because of the difficulties of being buried in consecrated ground. But she did a great job, didn't she? And I just love the way she wrote up her last few years. I think if anybody ever wanted to read that, she wrote, I don't know, you probably know better than I do.
Boringly religious, highly religious.
Yes, yes. But she wrote, as I hope you all are still, and that she wrote a lovely tale, didn't she, in her last few years?
But it's your father.
Yes, it was my father who arranged that replacement stone.
Oh, really?
So because
That's great.
The original one, the front of it shaled off. So that's obviously not the original stone.
Very good. Any other questions or comments from the floor?
Just an addendum. You're right about.
Sorry. I'll come back to you in a minute. Something's happening. I think there's a ghost appearing. Oh my goodness me. This is a bit scary. It is a ghost. I think it is a ghost. I think the ghost is in this room as well. So scary. I'm never going to go there again. Oh my goodness me. Hope you enjoyed that, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much indeed.
George, you were going to say something. Sorry.
You were right about 23. We own 22 and 23. 22 is where the lady used to cook for the prisoners of war.
Oh, how interesting.
The Italian business.
Right, we're just going to have a 2-minute changeover whilst David's box of pyrotechnic and audio-visual tricks gets disconnected before it does any more displays. So you can talk amongst yourselves for 2 minutes.
Leo and Craig, we can sort of plug it back in again. Is that your... Well, you wanted to cover everything. It's all about inclusion. Thank But that's why I was going to do it on there.
PowerPoint and the moving images. We're not quite there yet, hang on a minute. The Bremhill will be down the road.
Yes, I was going to say that's...
There was a first introductory slide, but it wasn't it's not projected to the projector.
We already have more.
He won't project the projector.
And it was only about our second week looking south and out. We came across and it was also cheaper because it was attached to this side. So I bought it for 60,000. And it was very poor, so there was no passenger. So we went through a bit to get another bit. This was we built a long passage. Rather than that, then we had to go into it. And the corridor. And the other house down there. No, sorry, the staircase here. And a very, very the other
Right. Thank you, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay there. Thank you, Craig, for solving the potential IT problem. This is Julian Orbach, who I think you're aware from the briefing you received earlier, the documents that he's recently produced the Wiltshire Personer, or the revision, is it the third revision of the Personer Guide, which caused him to come into the parish and see a number of the buildings. He's going to talk to us about some of the notable buildings in the parish. Julian, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean my book is fat, but of course it covers every parish in the county, so that in a sense my involvement in the 4 parishes that make up the Bremhill community was relatively small, and in the way of these kind of books, the editors knocked it to bits, and my original intention of having 2 volumes for Wiltshire probably, fortunately, was knocked on the head. And so everywhere has a concentration, because in the end the decision was that better a little bit more about each building than the text becoming more or less a list of items in each parish. So what I decided to do here was to just try and talk about the sort of issues that come up about particular buildings in these parishes, or buildings that brought up particular issues for me, and then I had to basically deal with them and decide what was the crucial thing to think about. Because whenever you go into somewhere, be it church or house or whatever, there's a selection of opinions, some of them cast in stone more or less, that this house was built by Alfred the Great, and that you then need to deal with, and sometimes you can upset all sorts of people by saying, well, what's the evidence? And then you have to come up with the evidence for whatever you decide is going to be the right thing. So, if I start, we've talked a lot about Anglo-Saxon Bremhill, and I guess everybody's kind of wondering what the evidence is. And it's these, what they call the long and short work, which is long stones and then short bounding stones linking the building, the thing in. And my feeling is that rather than the church being the church tower being the Anglo-Saxon evidence here, what we're looking at is the corner of an Anglo-Saxon nave, and the tower. I couldn't find any evidence for Anglo-Saxon, and there are several churches around this region. East Coker in Somerset, I think, is another one, where you have the cornerstones of an Anglo-Saxon building there. And the interesting part is that very often the actual dimensions of the nave, leave out the aisles, represents the dimensions of the early church. And so if that's so at Bremhill, we can't prove it, we're talking about quite a substantial church here. And then we get to this curious story, the always problematic story of the Anglo-Saxon Minster Church, where the one mother church is then the over church of a group around them. And we know that there's Westminsters and Warminsters, and there are minsters all around the country. But the interesting thing about Wiltshire is that when you look around the county, there are an awful lot of places that you go to, and you find that oddly the villages immediately around the main settlement didn't achieve parochial status till really late on. And so that we assume, well, with very good reason, that there are Anglo-Saxon minster churches in the royal towns of Caen and Chippenham, which leaves Bremhill in a kind of funny position, which is that it very definitely has its subordinate churches. It's just that it seems odd that it's kind of in between these two much bigger things. But I don't know, I think the argument, there is quite a lot of evidence that Bremhill had a serious Anglo-Saxon status, and I think the more we talk about it, the more we look at it, it seems to have had this special position that marks it out as an Anglo-Saxon centre of importance. And it's been suggested to me just now that the link to Malmesbury Abbey may have made it, because we're talking of Malmesbury Abbey being here in the 930s, so we're well before the 1066. May have been the reason it stayed independent, and the reason that it set up churches at Tiverton or Foxham or wherever. So that's interesting. And then you get when you get to Wales, everybody always tells you that a rounded churchyard called a class is the typical Celtic churchyard of the 5th and 6th centuries. And of course rounded churchyards do exist in England. and Tiverton Lucas is one of them. But our proof for Tiverton is just much less strong. It's there, but what does it mean? There are not an awful lot of rounded churchyards in Wiltshire, and I think it's fair to say that they are evident, or they're certainly a pointer towards an early foundation. The chief thing about so many of our churches is that there's a Norman font there when nothing else is Norman. Obviously, it's a problem. But one of the problems that I had is that very many of our churches got hit by the Victorians, and it's a bit unapologetic to say hit, but somebody came along and said that the church needed doing over, redoing, and these aren't going to work very well because I've tried to squeeze too many slides onto a picture. But this is the font at Bremhill, and we're fortunate that in the Wiltshire Museum there are the drawings of the Norman font at Bremhill. And one of the things that you'll see when you look up close is that the three bands of half circles don't touch each other in the drawing. Something has happened, and what I think has happened is a dreadful Victorian habit called scraping, where you took the whole surface off the object because it was worn or had got damaged over the centuries, and you recarved it as it was. I cannot imagine any way. Go back one. I can't imagine any other way in which you could go from smaller scale to larger scale and claim that they're the same thing. It is absolutely definitely the Norman font, but I think the dreadful Victorian scrape has happened, and it can't be undone. And if you want to see the similar half circle decoration, then Nettleton is a very good, relatively uncarved, unrecarved font. One of the things that you'll find all around this part of Wiltshire are these strange sort of organ pipe things, which people have called fluting, but actually fluting normally goes the other way, it goes in rather than out. But they occur, the reason I bring it up, is that they occur at the bottom of the font at Tiverton, which clearly is a Norman font and probably late 12th, and it combines two typical Norman motifs, arcading and this sort of pillow type fluting. And arcading and fluting is at Tottenham. It appears I must have gone there at some very, very patriotic occasion. And the fluting and the diagonal bars which you'll see on the Bremhill font occur at Tilshead. So it's, the fonts are important because they link our parish, the parishes we're talking about, to ones around. And when you start to look at Norman fonts outside Wiltshire, you'll find certain of the motifs spread much further around, much further than the county. This business, though, of what is real and what is not is something that sort of exercises, but it's always going to be there. And because of our luck in the Wiltshire Museum having this wonderful collection of drawings, mostly by John Butler, before the Victorians came in and hit the place. So here's our font again. And then here are the drawings of the columns. And you can see that something like that is going on in Bremhill. But the Victorians had an odd feeling that they liked things to be neat and tidy. And one of the neat and tidiness is that they, for some reason, didn't like columns without what are called neck rings. That's a neck ring. So that what we've got here is every single capital in Bremhill Church has a neck ring. Therefore, the Bath firm of architects who did it in the 1850s are, well, let's say that they're untidy copyists. It's not reliable. There are certain elements of each capital design. One might say take home and say it has a link back to the original, but it's sort of not good enough. And that's it's one of the things you have to sort of check for nearly every church in the county. How heavily did the Victorians do it? This is Tiverton, And this is, unfortunately, I couldn't get a decent enough picture of Butler's drawing of it, but this top one, not the bottom one, is his drawing of the arcade at Tiverton. And one of the worries when you go into Tiverton is it's just too tidy. You know, and then you come to documentation. What do you do with it? And the documentation about Tiverton only has two pieces of real information. One is that quite a lot of money was spent in 1802, and I think it's the plaster ceilings, because Victorians didn't like flat plaster ceilings. And the other one is that Canon, I'm going to use his name, Canon Rich, vicar from 1861, did something in his time. And the most that I can find out is that he spent 300 quid, which isn't enough to rebuild the arcade. And certainly there's a certain amount of furnishing which he paid for, but it could be enough to get these capitals and columns scraped, so that one would like a better drawing of the arcade at Tiverton to be certain that that is the right thing. But it's nonetheless it's a valuable indication of what was there. It's a very unusual arcade for the thinness of the columns. It's to do with the scale of the church, of course, but it's a very thin arcade, and it seems to be of early date. I mean, it's worth saying, one can't say it sort of, it's not sort of said often enough, but the late medieval work at Bremhill is not just sort of there, like in so many churches have a certain amount of perpendicular work, but some of it is very good indeed, and so that the tower is just a very, or the top of the tower, because obviously the rest of the tower is older, well proportioned, well designed, late Gothic. And then you have this very grand storied porch, which a certain number of Wiltshire churches have. But you know, a two-storey porch is a grand thing to have. And even grander than that is to have it really, really elaborately carved with the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, on the boss here. Very, very rich carving. And it doesn't seem to... I didn't find drawings of it, but I don't think that carving has been recarved as badly as the things inside. I think the architects didn't get at it, but somebody will probably put me right on that. Comparable, but a little bit earlier, is the storied porch at Churston, where you can see, I mean, interesting design of vaulting, but much cruder level of decoration in the bosses there. The questions you always ask, and things come along. You walk into Bremhill Church and you find an outstanding Baroque monument. It's one of the great joys of wandering around English parish churches, as you wander into something that you don't think is going to have anything in it at all, and then you find George Hungerford. And Hungerford is really quite something, because he's full of all the motifs of the Baroque before we get comfortable and Palladian and rather dull in the 18th century. So he's got cherubs, he's got the twisted columns that come into England probably from the baldacchino at St. Peter's and end up at St. Mary's, Oxford. He's got the twisted curtains and of course all the grand heraldry that went with the Hungerford family, and they couldn't resist putting it anywhere. And I had to advise me a chap from the Courtauld called Geoffrey Fisher, who was sort of the expert on sculpture of the late 17th and early 18th. And I tried very hard to get him to attribute, because it's always nice to know who did something, to attribute the Hungerford monument to somebody. And he came up, but he wouldn't let me put it in the book. This is what happens with experts. He said, I would think that it was a monument by Thomas Green of Camberwell, who I had to admit I'd never heard of. And he said the problems are that this chap dies in 1698, and the first authenticated tomb by Green is in a village you've probably all been to, Strugglethorpe in Lincolnshire. Sir Richard Earle, who died in 1697, so it's a little bit early, you don't know enough about it. And so I showed you, because of the cherubs, Green's major work, which is Sir John Holt, who was a Lord Chancellor at Redgrave in Suffolk, which has cherubs all over the place, just doing cheruby things, and not unlike. But the problem about cherubs is everybody did cherubs, and in a way what one wants is someone who takes a particular way of doing a conventional thing and then does it. So what one really wants with this monument is to find somebody else who did twisted columns but put the little decorations in the twists. And I haven't found it yet. So there we are. So Thomas Green of Camberwell may or may not be the man we're looking for in this case. I mean, Foxham. I mean, Foxham is a very special church, mainly because William Butterfield, who designed it, is a very special Victorian architect and one who had very, very clear ideas about what he was doing in churches and was uncompromising. And often people didn't like his work because it was hard or felt to be hard. Well, Foxham is rather odd because it's not hard at all. It's a very, very pretty church. And oddly, because Butterfield didn't always copy things that were there before, it seems to pay homage to the previous church. Only the previous church before it, because we know it was rebuilt in 1836 under Bowles, and I haven't found a picture of it in its 1836. This is Butler and before that, but the tower seems to have basically been there's a homage to it anyway. And if you go into Foxham, one of the things is that you'll find the particular sort of this is what lost Butterfield so many friends in the early 20th century, was that none of us could cope with impermeable decoration. But if you think about the 19th century and people filling things with coal smoke, gas smoke, oil, whatever, something that would wipe clean was not a bad idea. And Butterfield did great things with very simple things. And so when you go into Foxham, his tile work is all along the walls and around the window. And when he got a chance on a big medieval church at Heytesbury, he did all of this tile work around the chancel. I think to very good effect. But I mean, Foxham, I think, stands among Butterfield's works as a really complete one. Very often, vicars came along and didn't like, Victorian stuff wasn't liked, and stuff was stripped out. And it's the survival of some very odd and rather remarkable features at Foxham that makes it important among Butterfield's work. And one of them is this great screen in the middle, which it's Gothic, but whatever you think about it, it's not medieval. I mean, this is one of the things about Butterfield, is he rethinks he thinks in Gothic, but it doesn't look like any sort of medieval screen that you will ever find. But it's both designed to sanctify the chancel, as was expected, but also to be transparent so that you can see what's going on at the other end. And he was obviously rather taken with the Foxham thing, because he did it a couple of years later. He did a screen in a church he was restoring, which is also full height, at Baverstock, the other side of the plain. So I think the three churches each have their own interests, and really quite special interests, and they're worth recording for that. But if I was talking about rarity, which is another category, so like people always say to me, what are the rarest things that you find in Wiltshire? And as a joke, I always say original windows on council houses. And rarity is just is a category. It's a worthwhile category. And in a sense, there are a lot of Butterfield churches left, and there's a relatively small number of them that still have their features. There are an awful lot of medieval churches left, and there are medieval churches that have good perpendicular features like Bremhill, or good, even ones that have very early bells like Titherton. So that in the end, the rarity here, of course, isn't an Anglican church at all. It's this, which as far as I know is one of two, the Moravian settlement at Titherton, which is, it's basically a really charming example of the idea that a whole religious community could be brought together from nothing, or basically from the gathered congregation, and that in that community the unmarried women, the spinsters or the sisters as they called them, would have their own residence. There'd be another residence possibly for unmarried men, there'd be schooling, and that in a way the ideal community of God could be recreated on Wiltshire soil. And the only other example, of course, is the much bigger one outside Manchester, Droylsden, which is Fairfield, just a few years before. But when you go there, you'll find that the chapel is the centrepiece, you'll also find a sister's house, and all the features are there. And it is something very precious, and it's not just that the Moravian Church is precious in the sense that it's the one nonconformist denomination that takes us straight back to the heart of the Protestant Reformation. That we are actually talking about Bohemian things, and through Count Zinzendorf, and then coming through to the Brotherhood in this country. So there is actually a chain of descent broken by the 30 Years' War, but nonetheless a chain of events back right to the heart of Europe in the Protestant Reformation. So I think, yes, special indeed. The houses, I mean, there's so many good things in this parish. There isn't time to talk about all of them, so I'm going to sort of pick and choose around them. We have houses here from the medieval hall at Bremhill Court right through to the Regency of Bremhill Manor, and indeed early Victorian at Titherton House. There are very good mullioned window houses, stone houses, if you like, of the Cotswold tradition, of which this is a particularly good one, but nicely decorated with brick. So we've got, you can just about see that we're looking at a Jacobean style of porch with that pendant keystone in it, but probably there's a great big relieving arch over that window, which tends to be a 16th century feature. And we've got an early doorway at the Manor Farm, with another early doorway in here. The oak one within it is also is probably good 17th century work, and this probably 16th. And of course, because not only there are all sorts of frontiers in Wiltshire, and of course one of the great frontiers in this parish is the frontier between the stone and the timber, that you just have to go down the hill and you're in brick and timberland in the Avon Valley, and you're up here and you're in pure stone. And Cogswell has the delight of being basically a stone envelope on three sides, but on the side that you see, they decided that the prestige thing to do was to make a timber house. But the rest, all the other elevations, as far as I know, are stone. The big hipped roofs that appear in the late 17th, and they're ignoring that roof comes down here, so that's a later addition, but huge one on Cadnam Manor in 1690. Manor Farm again, we've got a 1702 date on the coat of arms. Somewhere around that time, the roof is redone. There are older roofs in there, but this roof, I think, is around 1700. And then 1715 at Bosmere, you've got another one of these very steep hipped roofs. And the interesting thing at Bosmere is that we're still entirely in the region of the mullioned window. That the sash window just hasn't yet appeared as being a major feature. But I think there's too much to say about the vicarage, Bremhill Court, because there are layers on layers of story there, and in a sense, from the historical point of view, it's this that is outstanding, that you have a crown post roof in the context of a raised crup coming up here, and the whole thing is sitting on a base crup, which you can only understand in the context of Garston Manor, where it's more easier to see. You can see the upper crup up there and the base crup, which goes down here. But this one is decorated in a manner that really is quite exceptional in Wiltshire, with this octagonal post in it. There's only 2 bays of it, and it's dated to 1325. I mean, 1325 is astonishingly early for things to be going on, and it may not have been a vicarage. It may have been of some quite different status at that point. But it's an outstanding find, because no one, until recent years, no one was looking. I mean, the interest of the vicarage, as we all know, was Bowles. And I mean, the thing that we've forgotten about Bowles is that in his heyday, before people started saying he's a silly old man who tunes his sheep bells in fifth, there was a moment at which he was one of the really widely admired poets. It's not for nothing that Lord Lansdowne and the guests, including the Duke of Wellington, were sort of brought up here to meet him. It's not for nothing that somebody as scrupulous as Coleridge revered Bowles, at least in the 1780s and 90s. I mean, it's, you know, he's been seen as sentimental, but he is a very important figure, and his vicarage is interesting because it's mainly a Cotswold gabled rebuilding of the 1640s, and then Bowles comes along. He adds all these little parapets and bits and pieces, and you can sort of see that's the same front. And the interesting thing about Bowles, which I've found absolutely no evidence for, is that did he design all these things himself? After all, he designed the garden, he designed the tombstones. I mean, I would have thought yes, because when you get to his house in Salisbury, which has that wonderful Latin name, is actually number 21, the close, you find his little funny zigzag parapets peeping up here and there, and he did that one in 1828, and this is done in 1818. But against that, unless somebody else knows better, I've never found any connection between Bowles and Sir Richard Colt Hoare. And Richard Colt Hoare covered everything he could see at Stoughton Church, including his own mausoleum, between 1790 and 1820, with the same, as I think of, Bowles parapets. So I don't know, but Bowles was really quite something in his day, and one of the great things that I've never seen anywhere else was that living next door to Bowles became an estate agent, reason for buying the house, like nice view. It says when they're trying to sell Bremhill House in 1833, the house is happily placed adjoining the beautiful church and parsonage of Bremhill, almost ensuring the friendship of its literary and amiable pastor. It's rather like saying if you bought a house in Compton Basset, you might just get the friendship of Robbie Williams by proximity, but it may not have happened. But I mean, he is, he's an interesting figure. The biographies have been written, and he's very much a self-publicist as well, so that there's an awful lot about him, and he's rather lucky that the Irish poet Tom Moore was a Bowood pensioner just over the way, and Tom Moore couldn't resist writing naughty things about slightly wicked remarks about him, but they liked each other, so it's good-hearted. When I came to Cadnam, I made a great assumption, which was that there's something incredibly old-fashioned about these big mullioned transom windows, and then for 1690 there's an almost French modernity about the centrepiece of the house, with these big heavy mouldings around the door and the window above, these channelled rustication going up it. It's got Hungerford sickles and Seymour angels' wings. I mean, it's a very sophisticated piece. And I jumped to a conclusion which I quite liked, but it was that Hungerford knocked down the previous one in the moated site, and that these mullioned windows were reused. But a much greater expert than me, Pam Slocum, said that looking at it, she could see no evidence in this surrounding stonework that these were second-hand. But I still stick to the idea that the concept that when you're looking at a house like this, and it's been built by a man as important in his area as George Hungerford, it just seems impossible to me that he would build something quite so old-fashioned while still doing something quite so modern in the middle of the house. It doesn't work unless because a lot of stuff happened for piety. The idea that you would keep bits from your ancestors' house isn't uncommon, right? Even from the Elizabethan, perhaps even the late Middle Ages. So anyway, Pam Slocum's gone one way, and I sort of left it as a question. But it's the way you come to things and you think, well, what am I going to say about it? And it's never quite as clear as one hopes, but never clear. And I'm not going to say anything today about the 20th century gardens at Cadnam, which are of interest in their own as being a really rather special, considering their date, really very special in a kind of national context. But too much to say, too little time. And so what I wanted to say, to finish with, is to talk about estate villages, because we're in one here. And the point is that any agricultural county that you go to will be full of estate building. And as we heard at the beginning from Simon Kerry, the dedication of the Bowood estate to housing its workforce was exemplary, and an extraordinary amount of building was done. And it's not, one of the things you assume is that everybody did it, lodges, estate cottages, but it's not true. There are 3 estates that are prime among, as it were, the housing and the setting of their villages, the housing of the workers and the rest of it. And 2 of them are ancient estates. One of them is an ancient estate, Wilton. Then there's Bowood, an 18th century estate, and then there's one entirely 19th century one, which is Griffleton up here, these pictures here, where Joseph Neild inherited this ridiculous fortune from King George IV silversmith, and spent it on rebuilding everything in sight, including Chippenham Town Hall, and the villages of his estate, and the churches, Alderton, Griffleton, Sevington, missed one up there, but yeah, there's a sequence, Lee Delamere, and they're very high quality to the extent of being mad occasionally. This is the Crowdown Lodge, where the story is still current in Griffleton, but the only reason for that tower is that when Neild's carriage was approaching from Chippenham Station, a semaphore signal could be sent from there back to the tower and the house. Absolute rubbish, because the tower and the house wasn't built when this was built, so that no one could have seen it. But then there's the madness of the school at Sevington, where the medieval bell tower from Lee Delamere Church was just taken away and put there over the medieval chancel arch from the same church, which is there when you go inside the Riros, the east end. So lots of medieval bits are reused. And then the 3 magnificent farmhouses at Lamb Hill, West Foscott and West Sevington. This is West Foscott, 1850. But they're all designed by a single architect who's patronised by Neild, a pupil of John Nash, called James Thompson, London architect. And we'll get to Bowood in a moment. Then you have Wilton, where I got very interested in that, because Wilton is notable in the Wiltshire context for these great big model farms. See, quite a lot of them, all down the villages spreading west from Wilton, and ridiculously large farmhouses. That's Little Langford up there, which is very Gothic, 1858. That's Chilmark, and then this model farm, which is a huge courtyard construction. Just beyond it, 1865 or so, there's a great big Tudorish thing called Burkham Manor that was actually the farmhouse that went with it. And then we come to Bowood. And the thing that's interesting about Bowood, I mean, one would expect the same things to be happening at Longleat and Longford and Corsham, and they aren't. I mean, there's quite a lot of estate building for the Poinder estate, which is Hillmarton and Harton Park near Corsham. Quite a lot of good housing, but Longford doesn't really have anything particularly interesting. The thing about Bowood is that when you go to Sandy Lane, you can start in the 18th century, which is early, obviously, and then you get a sequence of estate cottages characterised by cast iron windows, which sort of feature of the very early 19th century. So basically, there's a field of building somewhere in the early 19th. I just don't know the dates for all this. Then you have what I call the picturesque Tudor period, where somebody really rather good is working for the estate and designing the lodges, Kennels Lodge, Pillars Lodge, what's the one, Wessington Lodge in Carn. And then you get, in the late 40s and the 50s, you get the estate village outside the Golden Gates at Derry Hill, which is slightly different. These ones here all have this fancy bargeboard motif. These ones don't so much, but they've got a very interesting disposition, a way that they're actually designed for picturesqueness. It's worth standing for a while outside the Lansdowne Arms and looking, because it's a very fine group. And because they're so harmonious with the landscape, you don't sort of tend to notice how well they're done. And the other interesting thing is that there is a drawing saying that Mary, Countess of Shelburne, designed the pair that's across the road from the Lansdowne Arms. If so, she then turns out to be, I think, the first woman architect in Wiltshire that I know of, which would be interesting. And so that's the 1840s into the 1850s period. And then you get what we have here, which is there are two sort of periods in the 1860s, 70s, where one period type are all stone with these stone mullioned windows. That's one on Black Dog Hill, but then they go stone without the stone mullioned wooden windows. This is the beginning of the village outside here. And then very quickly, because basically the whole of this village out here, as far as it's dated, is 1872 to 4 or 5. It's a really short period. And then you get the brick changing to brick and wooden windows, which goes right on through into the 1880s. You can see them down Pewsham Way and anyway, all around the estates. Stanley Abbey Farm, I think, is 1881. Monument Farm is even later. But what's interesting is that in the Bowood estate, unlike anywhere else as far as I know in Wiltshire, there's a continuity of estate building about which we only know a tiny amount. And the reason that we don't know a lot is just quite simple, which is that estates didn't, apart from Grittleton, go out and commission an architect to do their work. What they did was they employed very highly skilled agents. And when it came to Wilton, very luckily, a chap wrote a book on the farms and homesteads of England in the 1860s, and he illustrated a great covered farmyard, which is now being slightly wrecked, at Bemerton. And he put, designed by Mr. Robson, Mr. S. Clark, architect. Well, Robson was the agent, and Robson's name is all over Wilton stuff, except on the estate drawings. So when you go to the Wiltshire Record Office, you can pull out sheaves and sheaves of drawings from the estate. Not a single one is signed, because they didn't need to. They were working in the office, and it was for the estate. And so that even whether Robson is the only man concerned, whether Clark carries on, Clark definitely designed the farmhouse at Little Langford, but they are names that just turn up. Longleat, there's one architect from Oxford who's involved in model farms, and at Bowood, I think one would have to find out who was there, who were the agents, and how did the process go? Did the agent sit down and draw something? There's a mysterious character who turns up on quite late in the 1880s, and I'm going to end the lecture on him because he's utterly uninteresting, but possibly of interest. I would say, in a police way, possibly of interest. In about the 1880s, a chap turns up, late 1870s, called Mungo Hart. Well, Mungo is a very odd name in Wiltshire, so presumably a Scotsman. And he calls himself he isn't the agent, but he calls himself Clerk of Works to the Bowood estate. And I think he's only named them when he's doing things that are not Bowood estate buildings. And this is the main thing I've ever discovered that he designed, which is the Methodist chapel on Silver Street in Calne as you drive in past the estate. But I know that he was involved in the estate because he designed the little reading rooms. There's one at Foxham, and there's one. Where's the other one? Is it the Charlcote? Is it? There are 2 or 3 of them, also in the 1880s. So what I'm really saying is that I can write a great big fat book about Wiltshire, right, and have Bremhill and Tivertons and Foxham, everybody sort of in there, and I can still come away after 6 or 7 years of writing the thing with questions that haven't been answered. And in a way, that's what's happening here, and that's what's happening with the book, and that's why history is never static, and that's part of the reason we're all here now. So thank you very much.
Has anybody got any questions immediately for Julian? We're going to have a panel format now, so you'll have some chance to answer more questions. If there's any burning questions that you want to ask right now, ask away. If not, I'd ask Louise and John to come and join us, and Simon.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Right at the beginning, you did those drawings about the fonts particularly.
Yes.
What date are the drawings?
Well, this is right. They're not all dated, but I think they're all John Buckler's drawings.
Yeah, so what would that be?
They're sort of 1805 to 10.
Oh, really?
Yeah, very early. Yes. Yes. And I must say I haven't seen the originals because they're online from the Wiltshire Museum, which makes lazy work for people like me.
Right, John, please. Yes. Louise, you want to speak to that? Okay. Right, this is a bit of an experiment, so bear with us. But hopefully, what I'm going to ask is Louise, who's been our professional historian, who has helped do all the research and write the book, which we're going to reveal shortly. I've asked her to speak briefly about the research and the project. John Chandler, who's been a great help in the project, will also talk a little bit about the work we've been doing within the context of the Victoria County history. And then we'll broaden out the discussion to talk a bit about what makes the parish special, what makes the project special, and you can ask any questions at that point. Right. If you go, Louise, over to you. Just talk.
Okay. Thank you very much to the previous speakers, and I don't really want to talk for very long, nor have I prepared a talk really. I think we've learned a lot from the talks this evening, and as Julian alluded, I don't think the history of the parish is yet complete, and it's certainly not yet written, and I've just written a book on the subject, so I can say that. It's been a 3-year-long project, and it has been a real labour of love. Unpeeling the layers of the parish has been such a privilege, and I think I have learned so much. How a small community was impacted by big events, and also how a small community could impact those big events too. There have been a lot of challenges along the way, not least the pandemic, which I know Martin was talking about earlier. It really did make things really complicated. We couldn't get access to our archive, and the book is written using primary sources, so we haven't just taken at face value what other people might have written about the parish. We've very much gone back to the original sources and artifacts to get our understanding better. Because the archive was closed, we had to move a lot of the research online. I was very lucky that a lot of the volunteers were still able to do research online, so transcribing wills was really helpful, and also analysing census returns. We did a series of talks online, which Martin has already alluded to, and that was all really helpful to a lot of those talks formed the basis of the case studies, which are a part of the book. It's a thematic history of the parish, so we talk about the social history, the economic history. We don't do it in a dry, factual way. We have these case studies to break things up, so we talk about the individual personalities of some of the people and the individual stories of what happened within the parish that make it so special. The stories are quite amazing, and what we uncovered actually helped form the book. When we were originally planning the book, for example, we didn't figure on having a chapter for the folklore, superstition and the witchcraft of the parish, but actually we found so much material that it just had to form part of a separate chapter. there are so many different characters in the book. It's really hard to pick out one or two. We found some really strong women, female characters who, people like Lucy Simpkin, who you may have heard of, who spoke at a very famous anti-corn law meeting within Bremhill. Her speech that she made just outside here one morning, or one evening rather, in 1846 inspired Charles Dickens to write a poem. There were other women who spoke alongside her, such as Mary Ferris, and other strong women further on back in time, such as Joanne Hale, who was a Quaker, which probably no one has heard of, but she was viciously persecuted, and her husband died for his faith, and the vicars of Bremhill were very much part of that persecution. Probably the most fascinating story that we've uncovered was probably that of the accused witch Agnes Miles, who was hanged for witchcraft in 1564 and was one of the very first people in England, if not the first woman, to actually be executed for alleged witchcraft. She forms an interesting part of the book. I don't really want to speak anymore. I think we've all had enough of people talking, so yeah, I'll hand over to John.
Thank you. I think Louise was being a bit modest when she said she'd written a book about Bremhill, because she's actually written the history of Bremhill twice. Because as well as writing it for this book, the whole project hinged on a collaboration between you good folk as a history project, a community history project, and a wider project which has been going on for over 100 years, over 120 years now, and which both, well, we all work for, which is Victoria County history. And it hasn't in Wiltshire been going on for that long. It started after the Second World War. And Louise's other history of Bremhill is a constituent part of a larger volume, our volume 20. We're not quite as far as the Oxfordshire ECH that Simon works for, but we're getting there. And volume 20 will cover Bremhill, but it will also cover Chippenham, which of course is a bigger kettle of fish, and a few other parishes around: Kingston Langley, Kingston St Michael, Pewsham, and Harnish. Can I say Harnish? Because I'm old-fashioned, rather than Harding English. And a few more. Christian Martlet's in it as well. So that volume is rumbling on, and I think in 2 or 3 years' time we might have a big fat red book with another history of Bremhill, which will be very similar in, well, it won't contradict what we just written, but it will be slightly different. So that's what I wanted to say about the Victoria County history, except to say that it's been going on for since the war, and there are now 18 volumes, 19, 20 and 21 in progress. I'll just say a little word about my experience of Bremhill. I approached Bremhill with some apprehension, I think, because when I was running the local studies library years ago, when it was in Trowbridge, Bremhill was one of those places you hoped you wouldn't get asked about, I think, because it's a big parish, lots of different places with different characters, and crucially, nobody had written much about it. I mean, Canon Bowles' book was not exactly cutting-edge local history, and of course it's nearly 200 years old, so quite a lot's happened since then anyway. What else was there to offer the inquirer by way of a parish history? Of course, we had highlights that did show up in books or stuck in the memory. The Moravians, of course, dear old Maud Heath, Bowles himself, the Dun Post, wonderful name for a pub. And bringing two of those things together, there was Hedner's oft-quoted terse remark about the inscription on the monument, which I'm sure you all know. He just said, the quality of the poetry matches that of the statue. Just a typical poster. And Julian's very, very I'm very pleased to see he's retained it in the new edition, more or less. He hasn't quite got it as the way he said it. But I want to say one other thing. Long ago, and I don't think this will be in the books, I don't think the listeners will know that, I noticed a throwaway line in John Aubrey. It's not specific to Bremhill, it's Bradenstoke, so it's not actually in the parish. So I don't know if you found it. But it's worth reciting. Aubrey, about 1670, he's standing up there on the end of Lyme Airfield, in fact, looking over Bremhill. And he says, over the rich green tough tappety vale to Cirencester, Malmesbury, Marshfield, Cullen, Mendip Hills and Cotswold bounds the north horizon. And that tough tappety is a form of taffeta, which is a crisp sort of plain fabric with a slight sheen, and it was used for women's garments usually. And so tough taffety was a rather luxurious form of it, which had a sort of tufted pile, the rich green tough taffety veil. And when you get your book and look at, and it did flash up earlier, there's a drone taken picture from behind Maud Heath's head on the monument. She's got a shopping basket there, and she's looking over the taffety green veil, just as Aubrey described it. And I think he got it to a T. So the book, when you get it, is going to be worth whatever it costs, just to have that picture. Well, Martin suggested I should explain why the villages that make up Bremhill evolved so differently. That's obviously I can't do that in 2 minutes. And even if I could, I don't know the answers. And anyway, I've got people on either side of me who know better how to do it, so I'm going to shut up. But just to say, I've revised my project, my full opinion of Bremhill. It's no longer terra incognita for me. It turns out to be a fascinating parish, great variety in depth, most rewarding place to research and understand. I'm very grateful to you all for letting me be involved in your history, so thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I guess what would be interesting to sort of ask the panel is, we have a parish here with a number of constituent villages, all of which seem to have separate identities. Does anybody have any sort of perspective as to why they have evolved quite so differently? I mean, is it the agriculture that does it? Is it the land ownership? Why is East Titherton so different from Foxham and so different from Bremhill, or is it the basic geology or topography? Anybody, or
I did write it. But I don't know. I've got the right answer. What I said, what I thought I might have to say. The best I thought I could say in Bremhill, because actually the geology is fairly uniform. It's Oxford clay, but it's not flat like it is in some parts of North Wiltshire. So you're blessed with a very varied landscape, although the geology, the underlying geology is much the same. Which I kind of see as a sort of microcosm of well, quite a lot of southern England in a way. It's got elements of lots of different terrains, if you like. And that means that you've got a great variety of villages, as you say. You've got a nucleated village, I suppose, here around the church. You've got the sort of stream-side hamlets, so Ratford and Hazen and Standard. You've got the small settlements perched on hilltops, Charlcutt and Spurhill. And then you say the difference between East Titherton and Foxham, but they both seem to me to be rather similar, and they're ranged around a sort of a green where roads meet, so a triangular green, which is another village type. And then you've got a Domesday manor that's reduced to a single large house, which is Cadman. And also then you've got, in typical North Wiltshire manor, you've got these solitary farmsteads, very often post enclosure, because they're then out in the fields that they consolidate. And I just thought you've got the sort of the whole gamut,
a bit of everything.
Morphology, yeah. And I mean, as Simon would know, the professor at Durham, wasn't it, Brian Roberts, who sort of classified every type of village and all the variations. This is a Class C, Stroke 2, Stroke A village. I don't buy that at all, but people have spent their professional careers trying to work out one village is different from another.
Simon, any sort of comments on the from what you? Well, it's an unfair question, but that's not.
Well, I mean, certainly the village that we're in here, Bremhill Village, smacks of planning. I mean, planning by lords is quite unfashionable at the moment in our archaeological studies. People have shied away. People are trying to move away from the idea that lords took a great interest in planning their villages and setting them out. But I think that's what you've got here. I think from the Anglo-Saxon period, you've got this Thane, whoever he was, basically establishing a church and a house, a sort of proto-manor house, if you like, with a well as well, with a source of water, and in an enclosure up here. So that's planned and set out quite neatly. And then I think in the Middle Ages, you must have what looks like a very planned village tacked on to that enclosure. And in effect, with this nice little neat sort of triangular piece of land out here, which must be like a sort of proto-marketplace or fair. You can imagine village gatherings happening here, and some sort of medieval fairs taking place. And you've got the cross as well, of course. I don't know, it'd be an interesting exercise to go and measure the width of the property boundaries here in the street and see whether they conform, whether there's a certain unit of measurement used to lay out the property boundaries. But I wouldn't be surprised if you find that they're systematically laid out, the property boundaries here in the village. So I think Bremhill village itself has a lot of planning, both in the Anglo-Saxon period and through the Middle Ages. And then, as John said, the other settlements in the parish are more sort of organic, if that's the better word, sort of more straggling or sort of loosely clustering around meadows or greens or commons or sort of along a stream or something like that.
And then you've got the influences of the fact that Stanley had an abbey. Then you have the Baintons owning most of the manors, and their relationship between them and the settlements was different. They had a secondary residence here at Bremhill and one at Stanley. There was a separate manor for Tiverton Lucas. So things, that different relationship with the landowner. Things happened along the way. East Tiverton developed in the way it did. I think it was very much from the Moravian community, which encouraged that there was the influence of the education from there. There was more dairy based there, and that went right into the 20th century. That things have a lot to do with the personalities within each individual settlement as well. I'm very much for the fact that it just takes one individual, and then you have for several generations, farms or even settlements are taken in a particular direction. So a lot of different things.
Julian, any comments from the architectural perspective to add to this?
Well, one of the interesting things here is that the layout of the village here doesn't look like the layout of a Victorian estate village, even though I was describing it as that. And I think what's been said is that it's superimposed on a very, very early plan. So if you go to, say, Grittleton, where there's the classic cottage with I can't remember whether it's quarter acre and a pig, but it's that kind of, each garden, each one has a very defined space, and they're much, much wider apart than the cottages here, so that there's a historical continuity here, which is underlies things in a way that just accentuates the fact that history is rolling on, and it's different from other state villages.
Thank you. Let's just talk a little bit about the project that we've done. John, are other people trying to do what we're doing, or is we can put them off if required?
Well, the VCH is active in, I suppose, about a dozen counties. Some counties it's kind of finished, some it never really got started, and some, like ours, are in progress. I think there have been other projects which have evolved lottery funding and have involved community groups. And the one I think of is in Leicestershire, the Charnwood Forest project. It was a Charnwood project, wasn't it? Which was done by a group in Leicestershire, in the sort of Colville, sort of that part of Leicestershire. I don't know.
There's the Codford book.
Well, we had, yes, about a decade ago, we had a series, well, the VCH itself got a lottery grant to produce more popular paperback books than the standard histories that we were doing. And about a dozen of these were done, some of these were done as, to some extent, as community projects. There was an Oxfordshire one which involved the buildings record, looking at the buildings of Burford, for example, in Oxfordshire. I'm not aware of one that's quite been tailored like this, where we've required one researcher to write the same history twice in different formats. And I don't know if anyone else is going to try it, but I mean, it's clearly been a great success.
One of the things we're very keen to do is to make sure it continues on, and we've got to, as everybody said, we don't know the full truth, we've got a version of it. Any perspectives from anybody on the panel as to things we should encourage other people in this room, or the next people who want to do some research? I mean, Simon, you set out a challenge to find the Roman road in the Northern Parish. Any other great unanswered questions or conundrums that you think we should charge ourselves with trying to address?
I think the most important thing is not to lose sight of what you've collected, so that the book represents one thing. But I remember when I was doing the South Somerset personnel, there was a village there in North Curry where they'd set out, without I think actually producing a book, to make a local history, and there was basically an outbuilding, agricultural building, which I think had a cafe downstairs, and upstairs was a really nice little library with an awful lot of documentation, as well as the few books that had ever been written about the parish. But it was that collecting together which I think made the thing ongoing. People who knew things would have somewhere to bring them, which is great.
We're planning on using the website a little bit like that, but a physical place would be good. Any other questions or comments on how to keep this thing moving? Simon, you give us some clues as to what else would you like us to look for in the parish?
Well, you've had a go at trying to test my theory of the Saxon enclosure around the church, haven't you? I mean, that's a tricky one to answer, because I mean, sherds of Saxon pottery are sort of like needles in a haystack, and so I'd be amazed if you actually found anything. But again, measuring the boundaries of the plots here along the village street and seeing if there's any sort of evidence for medieval planning would be a useful exercise. I think that's something that would be a useful project.
I mean, I guess the one thing I was hoping we would be able to do, which is you did do in the Codford project, John, is sort of show very explicitly the development of the how the housing was built at different stages. That we weren't able to do that.
I mean, I suppose there's perhaps more work to be done in the archives now that once they're reopened. Just the slightly mundane thing about going through council minutes, looking for exactly how much the council houses cost and what the debates were about, and later the building regs and planning commissions to work out the sequence of housing. I mean, you do it to some extent, no doubt, and Louise has done it, but there's always more you can, more imaginative things.
All right. Sorry, John.
Well, what's a catalogue of what's left of Stanley Abbey? I mean, because there are bits, aren't they, all over the place?
Yeah.
And including, I don't think, the bits that, there's Harold Breakspeare's map of the thing, which is fantastic, but there are also little bits of stonework in the farm down there. Catholic Church of Caen has got some of the tiles, but the tiles that are illustrated in the Wiltshire Museum online thing are not the same tiles as are in the Catholic Church. So they must be in devices, I don't know. Possibly, the fact that it's been being looked at for so long could well mean that the bits are all over the place, and there's quite a strong possibility that bits of the abbey are actually built into cottages around here and have never really been looked for.
Louise, what unanswered questions?
Well, I love Simon's take on sex in Bremhill, and that does actually feature in the book because I really got into that. I guess I'd also like to know more about the Bainton residences within the parish, the one at Stanley and the one they had here at Bremhill that we've only got fragments of, really. I'd like to know about the, you mentioned it, about the, in the former vicarage that we've got the timber there from 1325. It would be nice to know who lived there.
Okay.
And more about that. I would like to know more about the witch as well. I'm a little bit upstairs because it's
We're all going to get a chance to read about what we do know about the witch.
Yeah.
Let's throw it open to the group. Anybody got any questions or comments they'd like to make to ask this panel here? Helen.
One for Louise. Given we did this during COVID and you've had limited access to records, are there any records that you would like or think there's the potential to look at? Information from?
Yeah, I could probably give you a list because when I got back into the archive, I had to go through some of them extremely quickly too. So yeah, there is always, and there is an awful lot actually at the archive for Bremhill. So yes, an awful lot of work could still be done, sort of unpicking and going deeper. You can always go deeper. So yeah, I can leave that with you.
A bit like Helen's question, given COVID drove such a trench between research, writing and production of the book, is there a thought that there might be a chance in the future to have a list of, let's say, some or most of the what we might think of interesting houses and do some more face-to-face interviewing? Because I found on the book I did, it wasn't the archives that threw up how the houses came to be changed over the centuries. It was the owners who knew so much, not in great detail, but it made the picture much fuller.
Yeah, we certainly did rather less oral history research than we planned originally. Any other questions?
Do you know when Bremhill came to be known as Bremhill? Because I've come across an old, very old map that has it down as Bremhill. Yeah, Bremhill.
Louise.
So when did
the name goes right back to the Saxon period. We put it in, in Doomsday, and we have some disputed Saxon charters as well. So it has a very long.
This is supposed to mean the Brambly place, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is strikes you as a very odd name for a. Except Box is named after a plant, and also Bedwin, Great Bedwin, is named after bindweed. So there are places just named after plants.
We've got plenty of brambles.
That persists.
They grow well.
It is mentioned in Doomsday that there is specific mention of about 4 acres of thorns, and so it might be that was referring to the original thorns that inspired the name. Yeah, Hillbit came later.
Another question?
It's not actually a question, but it might be an opportune time for me just to say on behalf of Bremhill Parish Council, thank you very much indeed, not only to our very erudite historians we've got here today, but to the team, the community team, who have made this possible. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, you can see everything around you. It's just absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much indeed. I think it's put Bremhill Parish on the map, and it's because of that hard work that's been done by the team. So thank you very much indeed.
I just wanted to finish with some thanks to the team that's helped me help make this a reality, which is John Harris, Sarah Jones and Helen Stuckey, who have contributed ideas, enthusiasm and research and helped keep us all on track, and even lots of cake and lots of coffee, and maintained a good sense of humour throughout what's been quite a difficult time. Louise, for all the very hard work that you've put into the project. It's been great fun working with you. John, for the help you've given Louise. Elio, who's been I shipped Elio in from cross-county lines. She came from Hampshire and recommended by a friend, has been a great help with the editing of the book. This is the book. So here, you're waiting to see it. It's absolutely fantastic. Some really high quality words, some brilliant pictures and images. It's testament to the professionalism, high standards, and extremely hard work of John Harris. And I'd like to John's been involved in the writing, the illustrations, sourcing the photographs, researching them, getting consent, which proves to have been an enormously tiresome task. And he's worked something like 600 hours on this, entirely for free. And we greatly appreciate his efforts. Thanks also to the village coordinators, Ewan, Craig, Tom, Derek and Isabel, and lots of other people who've been involved along the way. And it's really the people that make us fascinating. I think when you get a chance to look at the book, it'll be the stories of the people. The buildings are fascinating, but it's really what the people did within the building that is fascinating. That really does tell me to stop. Our hope is that this book ends up in every household in the parish. That's the objective. That would be a huge triumph. Please do your part in that. Please buy one. Louise will be signing those now. It's £20, which is an absolute bargain for the amount of work that's gone into it and the quality of what's here. Give it away as presents to anybody who might be interested, and please tell people about it. We've got a limited amount. I think we've got enough, but please help us in making sure that it gets to everybody who might be interested. Thanks for coming, and Louise will move the rest of the panel away. Louise will be here to sign the books. There'll be some wine served at the back there, so you don't have to disappear just yet. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Just say something, echoing the words of Martin, can we thank you for your leadership and drive and energy behind all this. I don't think it would have happened unless you put your back right into it. It's quite remarkable. Thank you. And it'll be fascinating history. And where do we buy extra copies from?
Yeah.
I know by now, but other people
online.
Come online.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. And if you book one online, you can come pick it up. Right, that's fantastic. So do you want one sign or all sign? Yes, you can have that.
No, I'm not. I'm
going to charge this.
Oh, okay.
I was divided by 3/4. I'll get you the publisher. Yeah, I retired. I went to
Okay, thank you. That's a good solid first order, but we'll take orders at 5, minimum 5. Fresh out of the box, how about that?
The stories that only does like the house. That's why I say I really shouldn't make this. Like for instance, we used to hide in wells. It was maybe something.